Hello and welcome to the next episode, where I'll be talking about how two of my favorite things, architecture and cars, and how they come together. I'm going to break it down all within my favorite 3D modeling program, so stick around. My name is Stuart Hicks, and I teach architectural design studios and lecture courses at the University of Illinois at Chicago. This week, we're talking about cars and architecture and the way that they interact, overlap, and relate. Cars fundamentally change the way that we move in the world and the way that we occupy space in it. They themselves take up space, and they require the protection from the elements sometimes, and become inhabitants in the buildings that we build. Just as aesthetic but functional objects, cars have a kinship with architecture, a field that also contends with visual, cultural, and functional needs. So it's no wonder that cars have a significant impact on the buildings that we build in a deep and some not so deep ways. And in this video, I want to take a look into this marriage and offer some preliminary ways of thinking about it. And to do that, we're actually going to jump into Rhino, the 3D modeling program. Meet me there. All right, here we are in Rhino land. I'm taking up a lot of the screen, so I'll shrink myself down. We're going to start with what are called CAD blocks of cars. CAD blocks are computer-aided drawing blocks of sort of ready-made drawings that someone else made that we're able to put into the drawings that we make in order to give life and scale to the drawing. I think that kind of attests to how important cars are to architecture, that we would include them in drawings of our buildings in order to situate them in a context. So basically, I think that there are four fundamental ways that cars engage architecture. This is not all-encompassing. This is maybe just tipping my toe into this world that I think is very deep and is very rich. The first one that I want to talk about is that building sites are sometimes made more accessible because of the existence of cars. The example that I want to offer is Levittown, which was sort of initiated in 1947. There's a few different Levittowns that have different qualities, but basically these are settlements that responded to the need for housing post-World War II. Levittown has very large setbacks from the street because they're majorly auto-oriented, and the houses themselves are relatively unvaried, produced on basically an assembly line. I have over here what's called the Cape Cod model, of a later one that actually has a garage. Some of the earlier ones didn't have a garage. And so you would imagine that having a garage that faces the street would definitely not be a desirable thing if cars weren't so prevalent. Number two, we have buildings that look like or work like cars. One of my sort of mentors and favorite architects is Stanley Tigerman here in Chicago, where I am. And he won a competition once to build a parking garage, one that looks like the front grille of a Rolls Royce. So if you take a look at it, we have things like tire awnings that as entrances, but one entrance for cars and a symmetrical entrance for people, which I think is kind of interesting commentary. Three are architects that designed cars. There's a few instances of this over time. Curiously, none that are very popular as cars. But I have two really, I think, incredible examples here. This first one is by the architect Le Corbusier. He thought of this as the kind of minimum car. The governing principles that Le Corbusier deployed in designing this car, I think, are pretty close to the way that he was thinking about things like geometry in his own building. The car starts to kind of look like cars that would come a little bit later, like the Citroën or the Volkswagen Beetle. I think it's also really interesting with the Le Corbusier example that it has these really flat edges, which in my mind seems to relate to how architects design, because architects basically design through drawings, right? That there's an elevation, a plan, and a section, and those get drawn, and then those get projected into space to become full three-dimensional buildings. And I think that the car that Le Corbusier designed sort of bears that trace, and that can be seen in this full-scale mock-up that was made in the 80s for a museum. The other car that I want to sort of compare and contrast with this is the one by Buckminster Fuller. He built what he called the Dymaxion car, which was part of a whole host of experiments that related to lifestyle, architecture, design, and engineering, and trying to design a more efficient and capable life through technology. He built 3 prototypes of this car. One of them got crashed. Another one of them that I think has like 300,000 miles. The car itself has a pretty wonky design. He used a wind tunnel and plaster models to find an aerodynamic shape for the car. You sit very forward into the cabin, which becomes a liability. So the person who crashed the first prototype actually died in that crash. It also has some pretty complicated things, at least from my eyes, that it has a rear engine, but it's front wheel drive, and it has one rear tire that is used for steering. Number 4 are architects designing buildings for cars. And in this case, I'm going to focus primarily on parking garages. They're built for cars as well as for people. They reveal differing attitudes about what's suitable for an inhabitant that has different needs and capabilities than other inhabitants. So the car can do certain things and has certain capabilities, and humans can do certain things and have certain capabilities. And these are buildings that are meant to and accommodate both kinds of inhabitants. And the first example that I want to use is this renovation of the Michigan Theater in Detroit, Michigan. A lot of people have seen this. It's featured on certain architecture and ruin porn websites because of it's a kind of tragic statement of an opulent structure built for human occupation and for showcasing luxury, then sort of devolving into such a base and sort of stripped down kind of building or architecture that would be used for cars. And the remnants of things like the plaster ceiling become this testament to a failed Gilded Age opulence. The building then becomes this kind of conflict, right? Where it has this remnants of architecture for people and then this new structure for cars, and those things don't really go together. So it's not really a synthesis of being a building for cars and for people. Instead, it's really those things are kind of at odds with one another, and that's why I think this is such a poignant piece of architecture. The next parking garage that I want to show is actually part of a housing structure and development done in the 1960s by the architect Bertrand Goldberg here in Chicago. This is called Marina City. It was the tallest housing tower development at the time. So the housing units are on top and the parking garage is below. This is a mixed use structure. So when we kind of zoom into the 3D, we can see how the buildings are kind of like a kind of still life of different kinds of architectures for different kinds of uses. And one of those uses is inhabiting cars. This project was conceived as a city within a city to combat white flight. So people were moving away from Chicago. This part of the city wasn't necessarily the greatest part of the city. And this was developed to re-inject a kind of density to this portion of the city. And to compete with the suburbs, the accommodation of the car was an important component of the housing development. Some of the other features are a theater, a great steak restaurant, what was office buildings or office spaces, which is now a hotel, and some retail. The building was made out of concrete, which is a very popular material for parking garages. Concrete doesn't rust when it's exposed to the elements. So you can have this mono material that is able to go from inside to outside, or in the case of the parking garage, this kind of indoor-outdoor space, and be both viable as a structural material, but then also sort of carry up and through the rest of the building. And Bertrand Goldberg really wanted to sort of showcase the capabilities of this material and construction technique. So the architecture is built with these seamless swooping curves that are only possible when you're pouring wet concrete into wooden forms. This is the Temple Street parking garage by the architect Paul Rudolph. This building is also cast on site, but it uses board-formed concrete to achieve its sculptural curvature, and this choice produces a range of effects on the architecture. And that curvature is featured on the outside here. You can see the seams between the wooden boards and how the little bits of concrete are able to squeeze out in between each and every little board. The ramp, the swooping ramp, this really complex geometry that's at the scale of the car. So the radius that a car can move well at certain speeds is then having to be translated into physical material, in this case concrete. And the imprint of that process of building a wooden structure first is imprinted on the building here itself. And so there's a whole host of decisions that you can read in the architecture as part of this process. So like when the seam goes from wood that's turned in this direction to wood that's turned in this direction to produce curvature in one way and then in another, or over here where this big sweeping curve, we can see how the architect and the contractor had to segment the curve in order to be able to make it out of wood, because wood doesn't want to bend so nicely. Down here in this image, I think that this is really telling about the way that Paul Rudolph was imagining parking garages as being a vital infrastructure for urban life. That it's not necessarily just this like a loading dock, it's this thing that's like a hub, like an airport, like it's this place where people might come and go, and it would be this really vital piece of infrastructure. Parking garages don't need a facade in the same way that a building for people does. So when a parking garage has a facade, it has it for a very different reason than for making the inhabitants on the interior comfortable. And so I think that gives architects a freedom when they do put a facade on a parking garage to explore different possibilities for facades that maybe wouldn't be able to be possible when it's just a normal building. So in this case, it's the Welbeck Street Garage in London, which looks almost like a diamond or like a jewel set apart from the buildings around it, because it has this wrapping of concrete that has this patterning to it that wraps it indiscriminately. And this example is also made of concrete, but in this case, it's concrete that's not poured on site in the way that the other examples were. Instead, this concrete is poured off site in these small panels and then brought onto site and put up onto the facade in order to create this pattern. These are called precast units. Here's an example by the Architects Work AC where the parking garage is wrapped in a metal panel system that is offset by 4 feet from the parking garage itself. And then that metal panel system has these cutouts, and the space between this 4-foot space is painted magenta. And the building becomes what they're calling an ant farm of activity. And so in each cutout are different kinds of activities, like a climbing wall in one, or a slide. In one, there's a lending library, and another, there's a daycare space. And then finally, we get to my favorite example, which is 1111 Lincoln Road by Herzog and de Meuron in Miami, Florida. This building is pretty incredible for various reasons, both just architectural, aesthetic, formal, as well as urbanistically and programmatically. It's built in a way that makes the building look really unstable. So it has columns that flare and rotate, which creates this kind of destabilizing effect, which we'll look at in 3D in a second. The floors themselves taper in various places. There's a mixed use of retail and actually residential up at top, as well as event spaces. And every element of the architecture just looks too thin. So there's this real sort of destabilizing effect, like it looks like it's a house of cards that could blow over in a stiff breeze. And this is a place that has hurricanes, so we know that it's actually quite robust, even though it looks a little bit unstable. So this is it in 3D. When you look at it this way, all of the columns look like they are the same width, but in this direction, there are some of the columns which are turned sideways and some which look very thin. And isn't that cool? That's not a full 3D model. It's just the best one I could get. On the interior, there's this life throughout the building. So in this case, the life that's being featured by the building is not just relegated to the exterior. Instead, there's ramps and a full staircase that ramps up and through the building and creates little pockets everywhere where people can come in and occupy the space in various ways. There's retail in the middle of the building as well as that event space above. This model photo, which I found of the building, reminded me of a model that had been made decades earlier by the firm OMA, where the idea was that the city as a piece of paper that folds, that go up and through the building, and the folding plates of the building creates one continuous scene of activity as you move up and through. That's my initial dive into the relationship between cars and architecture. If any of that was interesting to you, please consider giving a like and subscribe. Thank you.